Planear la expansión ordenada de las ciudades del país es un elemento crítico. Debemos pensar en dónde van a vivir las próximas generaciones y cómo van a tener un acceso sostenible a sus lugares de trabajo. Debemos diseñar las ciudades antes de ocuparlas. Esto garantizará una adecuada provisión de servicios públicos. Para esto necesitamos tener información de cómo se va a expandir el suelo y de cómo y por dónde van a ir las vías arteriales de las ciudades. Para esto los dejo con Solly Angel, director del programa de expansión urbana de la Universidad de Nueva York, quien les contará un poco más sobre este proceso.
Good day. I'm Professor Shlomo Solly Angel, the director of the NYU Urban Expansion Program at New York University. We've been working with the Department of National Planning to help prepare 109 cities for their territorial organization in the coming years. By territorial organization, we mean the organization of the territory both in the city and the territory that will need to be occupied by the city in the coming decades. And we're talking about decades. There is a new plan prepared every 12 years, but we want the plans to be 30-year plans revised every 12 years. The plans for territorial organization follow and should be based on what we know about these cities already. And what we know about these cities already has been encapsulated in our Atlas of Urban Expansion. The Atlas of Urban Expansion that we've prepared for Colombia details and provides evidence on the increased population and area of the cities in Colombia. There's an interesting question that has to do with how much of the population was accommodated in areas that were already built by 1990 and how much was accommodated in the expansion area. We do not know the answer to that question. In Cairo, where we know the answer, and we will know this for, let's say, Bogota in the future, we know that 85% of the population added after 1990 to Cairo was accommodated in expansion area, and only 15% was accommodated by the densification of areas developed before 1990. In all cases, we recommend that cities prepare for their territorial organization and expansion, and at the same time rationalize or organize or improve their existing territories. To help cities in preparing for their territorial organization, we've created a basic manual. The manual is supported by large reports prepared by both international and local experts that go into detail about what needs to be done. The basic manual is a manual that is written in 3-line paragraphs, simple language, so that everyone would be able to understand it. It is not for experts, it is not for lawyers, it is not for people with 20 years experience. It is for us citizens who need to know about how to create a better organized territory for our cities. For this purpose, we used cartoons, among other things, that show critical issues that have to do with preparing for territorial organization. I'm going to use these cartoons in the presentation. Basically, what we're asking you to do is to go through a 4-step process. The first one, preparation, where we would like you to collect the evidence that will be needed for this evidence-based plan. The second is the diagnostic phase, where we would like you to analyze the evidence. The third, and that is important, and this is where lawyers do not really add much, is to use the evidence and, in addition to information that has been accumulated about good planning practice all over the world over the years, to use that information as input together with the data from the city in making the plan. So good ideas together with the evidence are what makes the plan. And the fourth is the implementation of the plan, putting it to practice. And the most important element of this exercise is the implementation of the plan. There is no point in making a plan or in collecting evidence that is not going to be useful in organizing the territory of the city in a better way in the future. What you see here is kind of a cartoon of a typical mayor that thinks of this making of this plan as just an exercise that he or she has to engage in, and that it's going to be shelved the moment it is prepared. This is not the idea. There is no need to create documentation. There is no need to do exercises that are not going to help the city create new facts on the ground. And creating new facts on the ground is the key to what we are recommending in the making of the new POTs. There is a kind of a tradition in urban planning of collecting a lot of data before people start to make the plan. This has reached, in many places, ridiculous proportions. In fact, I gave a seminar once, a graduate seminar in data analysis, and I asked the students to take a plan, look at the data volume that shows what data was collected to prepare the plan, and then look at the plan and try to find out the links between the data and the plan. And lo and behold, none of the students could find any link at all between the data that was collected and the plan that was prepared. People collected data just because they thought they needed to collect data, and then put the data aside and made the plan. They could have made the plan without any of the data. So the whole idea is to collect relevant data, data that is going to make a difference in creating the plans for the territorial organization of the city. And this data is rather minimal. What we really need are good maps, maps showing the extent of the city today, topographic maps that will help us locate future land uses, and environmental maps that are going to make it possible for us to determine what areas should be protected from development and what areas are right for development. In addition, we need some maps of the transportation system, of the infrastructure networks. Maps are the most important data elements for the making of the plan. We also need to go hand in hand with that population data and population projections to get a feeling for how much the city is going to grow in the future. There's very little additional information that is needed to make the plans. We listed that in the manual. Do not collect any data that you are not sure you are going to need. That is important. The second thing is, there is no point having experts take over the preparation of the plan. The plan has to grow from below. If the mayor doesn't own the plan, if the mayor doesn't understand the plan, if the people in the city do not understand and own the plan is just going to be shelved. So you don't need a planning degree and 20 years of experience to prepare plans. These are very simple plans. What the plan needs to be is basically a plan showing the expansion area of the city, showing where the infrastructure grid is going to be needed, what areas is going to be protected, and there is no need to determine exactly each and every land use in the future. This will happen by itself. There are market forces that will determine where certain land uses are going to be. There's market forces that are going to determine densities. You don't need to decide that as part of the plan. Too much detail has gone into plans in the past to show detailed land uses and detailed building volumes. It's not necessary. These things are never going to happen according to the plan. An important note here is about the relationship between making environmental analyses and maps and plans and urban expansion. Right now, unfortunately, the relationships between city planners or city developers and environmentalists are not so good. One is pushing towards more development. The other one is pushing against less development. This is not a good setup for making realistic plans. We need to understand from the environmental analysts what are really key areas that should be protected from development, because there are assets for conservation, because there are assets that need to be protected, like wetlands, to keep the fauna and the flora there, or the rivers and their edges, or lakes and their edges, or important forest assets. We need to know what needs to be kept and what can realistically be kept. The rest should be available for development. So what we don't want to hear is there should be no development unless we say so. We would like to hear the opposite message. You can develop in all the areas where we do not say this is not a good place to develop. So it's another kind of formula. Let's allow for as much area that is needed for urban expansion, avoiding places that need to be protected, rather than prohibit development anywhere unless we say that you can build there. We need to keep adequate land in development in order to maintain a healthy land supply, in order to maintain a healthy residential land market, in order to maintain affordability of living and working places. If we choke urban expansion, if we choke the land market, we have high land prices, people cannot afford housing, and when people cannot afford housing, poor people cannot afford housing either. The same goes for what we do with the informal settlements that are currently occupied by poor people. Generally, I have seen a number of cases in the world where these places are invisible. In the map, instead of identifying and mapping informal settlements, they are mapped as green areas. I'll give you an example. I visited Panama City once. I looked at Panama City. It's built on mesas with steep slopes. The poor people live on the steep slopes. There were at that time 150,000 families, maybe 1 million people living on the steep slopes. Every once in a while, when there was a hurricane in Panama, a few of these houses would tumble into the river. As a result, the government, the city planning department, determined that all of these areas were unsuitable for development, and all of these areas were essentially green, and people had to be relocated. Who's going to relocate 1 million people? Nobody. All you need to do is strengthen the drainage systems in these people, and there's a study that shows that with strengthening the drainage and creating canals and creating some retaining walls, 95% of the people there could be protected from landslides. So instead of ignoring these people or saying they have no room to be there, these people need to stay. They are building neighborhoods. They need to be provided with infrastructure. They cannot remain invisible. So making informal development visible. And not only that, but in the case of Colombia, building simple rules for informal development to continue instead of thinking that it is all of a sudden going to disappear in the next plan is one of the lessons that needs to be learned by these planners. So what we are thinking in terms of the expansion area, what we're thinking is the creation of an arterial grid of maybe 30-meter wide roads throughout the expansion area, maybe 1 kilometer apart, and then leaving all these macro blocks for development, both by formal and informal developers, and only requiring minimal layouts from informal developments so that they can quickly turn into real neighborhoods. So leaving them or ignoring them or pretending that they don't exist, turning a blind eye to informal development is a mistake. If we can get them to just lay out the communities in a way that can later facilitate the provision of services, we've done the most we can do to turn them into regular neighborhoods in a minimum amount of time. A great example for me is the neighborhood of Comas in Lima, a squatter community that was created in the early 60s on the outskirts of Lima. Now these squatters, rather than just coming each one on their own, were actually organized by radical priests at the time for an invasion of an area, a kind of basically public land at the periphery of the city. The priests asked engineering students from San Marcos universities to lay out the community before they invaded it. They laid it out with plots, 10 meters by 20 meter plots, and 10-meter roads between blocks, and then they invaded. This community quickly became an organized neighborhood, and when I looked last year at real estate prices in Comas, a squatter plot of 200 meters with a 150 square meter house on it cost upwards of $180,000. And this was a completely viable neighborhood with cafes, with doctors' offices, with basically a thriving middle-income community. And the whole difference is in the layouts. To give you another example, I just read another study of Tanzania where a British scholar analyzed 19 World Bank projects that were done at the time. Some of them were infrastructure upgrading in informal settlements, and some of them were what we called sites and services, namely organized layouts where people got plots to build. The difference between them, 25 years later, the increase in the value of the informal areas that were upgraded was 30%. The increase in the values that were laid out before they were built were between 160 and 200%. This is what you have to think about when you are thinking of how to incorporate informal settlements into your plans. What you also have to think about is metropolitan-wide planning. You know, the cities surrounding the 4 big metropolitan areas in Colombia, the cities surrounding Bogota, Medellin, Cali, Bucaramanga, all have to get together to plan, not to unite or to lose their power, but to agree to create a system of arterial roads that unites them all together. They cannot plan arterial roads separately from each other, and to create, you know, like sewer systems or environmental protection systems that take their own interest into account. Failing to do that, again, will be a major failure of these metropolitan areas to function as metropolitan labor markets, to function together so that every person in the metropolitan area will have access to all jobs and all firms will have access to all workers. For that, you need some form of serious metropolitan coordination, at the very least in creating metropolitan transportation network. In terms of land use, again, there's a tendency to make unrealistic assumptions about land use. Typically, people making plans dedicate too much area for industry. The Chinese are notorious for that. Some cities in China have 40% of their area planned for industry. That shrinks the area available for residential occupation, and again has an effect on the housing market and on affordability and on the poor. There are all kinds of tricks that planners use to avoid doing things correctly. Among other things, what we need is a network or a hierarchy of public open spaces, large and small, that are accessible to all the people in the city. There's no point in taking some mountain and declaring it an open space to increase the amount of open space per person in the city. This is a dysfunctional open space. Open space is designed to protect, let's say, rivers, lakes, important areas that need to be protected from an environmental perspective, but also to provide access to people from densely settled areas into open space, and also to create a place to breathe in the city rather than have kilometers upon kilometers of built-up area. Clearly, it's not only a matter of expansion. We also need the densification of existing neighborhoods. We need to build more. We need to maybe add a floor or two to existing buildings with the same style without disturbing the character of neighborhoods. There is a lot of resistance to densification. People resist densification because they resist the status quo. They don't mind it in general, but they want it elsewhere. So what we need to do is we need to create the kind of densification that promotes community and that helps community, rather than the kind of densification that some developers want, namely to destroy houses in the community and instead build some condo with a swimming pool and a big wall around it, some kind of a walled community that is not really part of the neighborhood. What we want is densification by allowing people to build more on their plots, to build higher, to fill up the plots, but to keep the character of neighborhoods while having densification. We also want real participation. We want people to become part of the plan rather than being told what the plan is and participating in some meetings that are not really, where they can't really have an influence. So we would like people to be involved from the beginning, throughout the process, in the steps where they're asked serious questions about what their vision for the city is, how much they're willing to go towards implementing that vision, rather than presenting them with some fait accompli plans. There also always be people who would like to avoid the plan by either moving out or by using certain rules that allow them to not comply with the plan. We need to think about realistically about enforcement, about regulation. There's no point in having regulations that are not going to be enforced. So I'd rather not have a regulation than have one that is broken and broken again and again. Finally, there is serious lack of empowerment of municipalities and lack of seriousness, even though the laws are all there, to actually raise income for financing infrastructure and financing public works from the increase in the value of real estate in these cities. So when we bring in development, when we bring in roads, when we bring in infrastructure, when we bring in schools, land values go up. When land values go up, they go up because we introduce the infrastructure and the public works. So there's a very good logic for recovering that increase in value. There are many tools already available in the law for doing it. It's just a matter of goodwill and the community getting together and ensuring that this is something serious, that we want public works, that we want to pay for public works, and we need to make that happen. When you keep some of these stories that I've told you in mind, you're going to come up with better plans that can be put on the ground, that can make a real change in the lives of people in your cities. Thank you.